All right, well, thank you for being with us this afternoon for this panel titled The Role of the Law and Leveraging the Courts for Climate and Environmental Justice. And in just some of our side conversations, we're a panel that'll be answering questions, but quite frankly, I feel like these are the questions that we are grappling with. In being invited to participate in the planning for some of the content, this was a question that I personally brought to the table as Dana Johnson, serving as Senior Director of Strategy and Federal Policy with We Act for Environmental Justice. So lead all of our federal advocacy, legislative, regulatory work, and just watching what we see happening with the courts, and its influence on our work, our ability to make a difference, a positive difference in people's lives. I have a whole lot of questions. And so we have a panel of folks whom I believe to be experts that are going to support us in maybe not answering the questions, but asking ourselves the right questions that we might explore at a little bit of a deeper level outside of this space. So to just really quickly introduce our panel, I'm just going to share with you their names and titles, but when we get into the questions, we'll have them talk a little bit about their work as an intro to some of the answers that they provide. But immediately to my left is Dr. Nicky Sheats, who currently serves as the director of the Center for the Urban Environment of the John S. Watson Institute for Public Policy at Thomas Edison State University. And next to Nikki, we have Patrice Sims, who serves as vice president for Healthy Communities with EarthJustice. That part is missing, and he is based in Washington, D.C., and then we have Nicky Thanos. Nikki, we don't have who you're with, so I'm going to apologize. Okay. But Nikki is an accomplished movement lawyer, and I had to go into it, didn't I? I'm going to stop myself. Nikki.
I work for Movement Law Lab.
Movement Law Lab. I saw Movement Law in my head, but I wasn't quite sure, so I didn't want to say it out loud. All right, y'all. So for today's panel, we want to set the stage for the environment that we are operating in. But before we get to that, and then, we'll move into a 15-minute session that Nikki is going to facilitate to expand upon that. But when I came into We Act about 5 years ago, I came into the middle of the Trump administration, and I remember reading a New York Times article that said at that point in his tenure, he had either rolled back or was in the process of rolling back more than 100 environmental laws. 98 of them had been completed at that point, and 14 of them were in progress. And they spanned the gamut of air pollution, emissions, drilling, extraction, planning, infrastructure, animals, water, toxics. And what was interesting that stood out with me that I've held on to when I read that article was one of the attorneys that was responsible for helping to do the assessment, the study, the analysis, said that this was a very aggressive attempt to rewrite our laws and the meaning of environmental protection. And so, by the time we got to the 2020 election, we saw more than 400 voter suppression laws at the local and state level be introduced. We saw Trump have tremendous influence on our courts. During his time, 234 judges had been nominated and confirmed, 3 of them in our Supreme Court, 54 in the Court of Appeals, 174 district courts. So we see a lot of influence on our court system. We see a lot of influence on people being able to engage in the voting process, to be able to make decisions about who sits in power of authority. And I'm from Chicago, and so, like judges are on our ballot. And so we see, or they were, we see a lot of influence. And so we want to talk about what does that mean in the short term for us achieving climate and environmental justice, and then what does that mean, what should we be doing in the long term, and what should our long game be to organize ourselves around achieving justice. And so let that be in your mind as I turn it over to Nikki to take us through an exercise.
Great. How's everybody feeling? Okay, you're going to have to do a little better than that. How's everybody doing? Okay, so everyone knows this, but the time slot on an agenda that's after lunch is notoriously like the sleepiest session at a conference. So we thought we would start us off with a spectrogram activity. This is like, these, we used to do this all the time when we would gather in person, where we're gonna make a spectrum across the room. This is an absolutely not ideal room to do this activity in. And so we're just gonna figure it out. It's gonna be great. I think most of us will have to be in this range. If you're kind of over there, you can make it work too. This is gonna be the middle of the spectrum, and this is one end, and this is the other end. And so if your body allows you to, you're gonna get up, and you're gonna move around, and you're gonna sort of put yourself on the spectrum where you think you are in response to the prompt. Is this familiar? Have people done this? I know we're on Zoom a lot these days, but yeah, okay, great. We've adapted this to Zoom, but it's way better to do it in person. We just wanted to open up with some big questions that are on our mind all the time, but they're big questions that we want to open up in this conversation too. Everybody ready? You can digest, so stand up, here we go. The courts are a viable place to move a progressive agenda. That is going to be over on this side. The courts are a viable place to move a progressive agenda. And over on this corner, the courts are not a viable place to move a progressive agenda. These spectrograms, before you move, I'll just say, they're designed to be problematic. They're designed to make you be like, no, it's a both and, it's a whatever. That's cool, just do it anyway. So over here, the courts are a viable place to move a progressive agenda, is this corner, start moving. And over here, the courts are not a viable place to move a progressive agenda. What do you think? Right in the middle? Oh yeah, I want you up there. Okay, I'm gonna give you 10 seconds. 10, 9, 8, find your place. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If, as we're talking, someone says something that makes you change your mind, get up and move around, okay? Tell me, somebody in this camp, why are the courts a viable place to move a progressive agenda? Anybody? Tell us your name first.
Malik Edwards.
Hey, Malik.
And I guess the question, we're talking administrative courts.
Oh, don't lawyerly me. You just answer the question.
No, because process can gum up the works, and the way you do that is going to court, so it may not even be...
Okay, speak in the mic.
Sometimes what you're trying to do when you go back to what Trump was doing is you want to gum up the works. Yeah. And so what you're doing to move your agenda forward is keeping them from taking things back, and the courts can be effective there. You can challenge and make them start the process all over.
Okay, so Malik's saying we're moving a progressive agenda, even if all we're doing is keeping the muck rolling. We're sort of doing that plumberly lawyer work of getting out the clogs, keeping everything moving. Yeah? Okay. Anybody else over here? Why else are yeah.
So I think, one, federal courts, of course, we have our concerns when it comes to Supreme Court, but there is always that space for the state courts. And also, when I think about some of the big cases when it comes to climate misinformation and accountability, I don't know how you do that without the court system. So I think it's also a great way in order to hold folks accountable.
Great. What's your name?
Brittany.
Okay, so Brittany's over here. She's saying, hey, the courts are a terrain, right? We have to contest the terrain. And also, the federal courts aren't the only terrain. We've also got state courts. We've got local courts. We need to play everywhere that we can. What's your name?
Anne.
Hey, Anne.
Where there's a lot of political gerrymandering, sometimes the courts can be a backstop against that, and that's helpful where feasible. Since we're in North Carolina, I will say it's not very feasible here, but we try.
Right. Okay, so there's things that we can still win in court that are super important. All right, what about somebody way over? I want to hear some haters on the law over from this end. Anybody? Anybody? Yeah.
My name is Betty Billiard, Tribal Councilwoman for United Home and Nation, and I am from Louisiana, and Louisiana is dragging their feet in the courts with moving anything towards, sustainability. We're heavily influenced by oil and gas, so getting anything through the courts, they're rolling back regulations and whatever they can to keep that industry moving. So it's not very friendly in our area.
Right. So Miss Betty, I'm from Louisiana also. What can we win in Louisiana these days in the courts? Screw the law. There's lots of things that we need to be doing, and the law is not really going to get us anywhere. Okay? All right. Yeah. I'd love to see some people moving around as we're talking too. If you find yourself influenced.
Does this work? Okay.
Yep. What's your name?
I'm Carrie.
Hey, Carrie.
I think sometimes it depends upon how you're using the law, because I understand, the gumming up the works part. It's an important tool sometimes. My role has been more in ensuring that the law as written is implemented and complied with, and that is fundamentally conservative. It's not about change. It's about implementing what is already on the books. And so that's not a bad thing. Like, that could have me standing over here saying it's not progressive because I'm not getting change, except for I want what we are owed from the law. So
great. Thank you, Carrie. So that's definitely something we want to talk about with you all today, right? Most of us are doing work defending the wins of the past, right? We've got some great laws on the books. The question is, how do we enforce them? How do we make them tighter? That is different, right, than actually moving an offensive agenda. I saw a hand in the back. Yep.
So, this is Al Elia from Civil Rights Education Enforcement Center, otherwise known as CREEK. In terms of a sort of hater perspective, we, for the first time, I think in quite some time, if ever, during the Trump administration, we saw Department of Justice completely reverts itself on some cases. And so I feel like, to the extent that we are pursuing cases, at least in federal court, against states, states may be willing, and probably are, gumming up the works so that the cases get dragged out long enough to switch administrations, so the Department of Justice, if maybe it would be on our side under one administration, would be on their side and under a different administration.
Okay. Anybody else? I'll take one more comment on this one.
Hi, everyone. If I sound tired, I am. I've been traveling since Saturday. I'm Deanna Brown. I'm from Flint, Michigan, and I am a hater of the courts. Because if you... Hey!
You're from Flint. Why would you hate on the courts in Flint?
Oh, why would I hate on it? Maybe because, 2 weeks ago, the AG decided not to continue to press charges against Rick Snyder, who poisoned my city, Boo, right? And it personally affected me in many different ways. I'm developing cognitive issues from drinking the water, so I am a big hater of the courts.
Thank you. We have about 5 more minutes? Yeah? Okay, let's do one more. Over in this corner, what is most important is to alleviate suffering, right? We got to meet people's material needs. People need housing. They need water. What's most important is to alleviate suffering. Over here, what's most important is to build power, okay? Oh, everyone's going to hate this one. We're going to draw the nuances out. What's most important is to alleviate suffering. What's most important is to build power. Think about your actual work, okay? Obviously, we need both. But think about your work right now, the work that you're moving in coalition. Which of your work is power building work and which of your work is alleviating suffering? Okay, Y'all hated this one, but you also moved all over the room on this one. Who wants to start us off?
I think alleviating suffering is building power.
Thank you. Okay. How do you build power if you don't alleviate suffering? Okay. Yeah. Did you just raise your hand?
No,
Oh, it might have been someone behind you.
Oh, I did, but it's similar. But I had someone tell me once in a religious setting that they would rather give someone a holy text than like food if they were hungry, and that's kind of fundamentally made me over. Because how do you build power if you're hungry? How do you build power if you don't have a house to live in?
How do you build power if you don't have your basic needs met, right?
Yeah.
Right? Okay, great. Other folks? Yep. Dana.
I think in this country, we have to function, we have to operate within the system, and this system is set up on power. And so if people are disempowered, then we don't get to meet just your basic needs and build from there. And so for me, we need the power, because that's where a whole lot of effort has been put.
Great. Who else? Ebony, right?
I kind of agree. I feel like I was originally leaning towards alleviating suffering, but the more I think about it, how do you really, we've been trying to alleviate the suffering, right? We've been trying to go through the courts and utilize the system as it exists to get our needs met, to get basic, basic rights, and it's not working. And so I think part of the reason it's not working is because we have been disempowered, and we have to reclaim that power to make the people do what we want them to do, because otherwise,
Right.
they don't listen.
Okay, so Ebony is over here saying, hey, how can you build power if you haven't met anybody's material needs? How do you meet material needs if you haven't built power, right? Great way to start our conversation off today. You guys can go back to your seats and we're gonna get started.
All right. I don't know, Nikki. I'm so annoyed by the what is it, the stratogram? What did we just do?
Dana does not like the spectrograms.
I'm so upset about the spectrogram because I just...
Spectrograms are so dissatisfying, right? Because you're, especially for a group of folks with legal training, and I'm including all these organizers in here who have great legal minds, right? Want to debate the nuances of words. Yep. Okay.
Right, debates the nuance of word, and the fact that we have to have a conversation about like people's humanity, I think, is what has me where I am. So I think for the next part of our conversation, we really want to jump into some dialogue around where we are with the federal courts. And I am going to invite each one of the panelists up here to talk to us about the current makeup of the Supreme Court through your perspective. And I don't know who brought up the point about, the conservative nature of like the courts and the law. So I think it'll be interesting to have everyone's perspective about the Supreme Court. What do you see as the impact of recent decisions related to affirmative action and, even environmental issues like the EPA versus West Virginia? How do they impact climate and environmental justice, civil rights, and democracy? And what are some of the things that you are noodling on? What are you thinking about when you think about the future impact? So that was a whole lot. That was like 37 questions.
I'm starting, and I got to start. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I did go out of order because I think Patrice
was
wanted
going
you
to
to
start.
set some
Great. I'm happy to do that, especially after that thing you made us do up here, which I'm really angry about, by the way. So I want to say a few things because I think I want to put in context of the conversation about where the courts are now, and it relates to this exercise that we just did. When I think about advocacy and I think about change and driving change and the role of the courts, I think about the courts as fundamentally being able to play three different functions, right? One dimension of what the courts can do is to be a tool to drive change, right? To advance and make progress. And we've seen that, right? If we look at Brown v. Board of Education, that wasn't going to happen across the country organically from the bottom up in the states. That sort of a dramatic change that needed to happen in a way that said, this is now the law, and we're going to push everyone in this particular direction. The courts do another thing, which is they function as a tool to drive and demand compliance with the law. Carrie talked about this, wherever you are, Carrie, right? This idea that the courts play this function that allow us to take the law into a chamber where it can be reviewed and enforced and demand that compliance with the law happens in the ways that the law intended, in the way that the law is designed, and the function of the courts generally can serve to push back against threats to democracy. Right, can function as a shield against tyranny and despotism and fascism and all those things that we want to keep out of our political space. And where the court is with respect to its capacity to play those various roles changes over time. Right? It changes in subtle ways over time, and it changes in really dramatic ways over time. And when I think about just thinking about the exercise we just did, and we asked the question, can the courts be a place to drive change? In some ways, the answer to that has to consider, well, what's the temporal consideration that you're thinking about this? If you're thinking about this over the course of, 100 years, 200 years, yes, the courts can play a role. Are the courts going to play a role to drive change in the next 5 or 6 or 8 years? I doubt it, right? Because they're just, and this gets to this question, where are we with the courts right now? We have a court, we have a Supreme Court, and obviously the Supreme Court is important for a host of different reasons. Fundamentally, with respect to federal law, it decides the law of the land, which then affects the entire country, as we know, and we have a really extreme Supreme Court right now. We have a very extreme Supreme Court. So extreme that not only is it taking conservative views within the boundary lines of the precedent that it's presented with, it is rejecting and throwing out precedent and going in fundamentally new directions and operating in ways that we've not seen the court operate certainly in my lifetime, in terms of its activism around being willing to reject well-established principles of law. That's really dangerous, right? That's really dangerous. There are some really practical things as we get to this question about what's happening now with respect to the work that we're doing. You mentioned this idea of West Virginia v. EPA, and it's really important. It's helped to solidify this idea that the court has adopted over the course of the last decade, roughly, of incorporating this major questions doctrine, this idea that agencies can't do anything unless it's really, 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 really clear in the underlying statutory authority that they're allowed to do exactly that thing and do it exactly in the way that they're attempting to do it. This is a fundamental change with respect to some of the things that we work on, certainly in the environmental space, because as we look back at things like the Clean Air Act, and we look at decisions like Massachusetts v. EPA, which allowed us to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, under Section 202 that regulates motor vehicles. Those were the kinds of places where agencies like EPA were not operating outside of their statutory authority. They're operating consistent with, and frankly, in a manner that was demanded by the statutory authority. But it was not exactly and precisely what Congress contemplated at the time that they adopted the statute, and it wasn't spelled out in the ways in the statute that made it absolutely crystal clear that the agency should be doing this and should be doing it in this way. And those are the kinds of things that the court is really, I think, is going to fundamentally reject under this sort of major questions doctrine. And I think there are many decisions that we've seen over the course of the last 10 or 15 or 20 years that this court would decide really differently in negative ways, in ways that adversely affect people. And what that means is, right now, that one function that the court can play about driving change is not a function it's going to be playing. It's not going to be a place to go to stretch the law, to bring in a new thing, to get another, to encompass some protection or some concern that wasn't being fully addressed, and stretching our statutory authorities to do that. That said, not everything, in fact, very little gets to the Supreme Court, so that's helpful, right? And we are seeing shifts in the other federal courts, as we saw a bunch of appointments across the federal judiciary during the Trump administration, extremely conservative judges. That's going to affect the outcome of cases, and it's going to be, and is functioning already as an invitation to corporate interests and industrial interests and other interests that are in opposition to community, to try to get issues in front of those courts and in front of the judges to get far right sort of answers to the questions, some of the questions that they would like to have answered in dangerous ways. That's something we have to be really attuned to. But at the same time, the courts are still a place where, and again, Carrie alluded to this, the courts are still a place that we can effectively use to enforce the law as it exists, because as the truth is, the law is not being enforced properly. There is non-compliance everywhere, and non-compliance in ways that are dramatically impacting people and communities across the country. And the courts are still a really important and valuable tool in that regard. And just one last thing, I could do another 40 minutes on this, but I won't. I want to hand it off to other folks. But the one last thing, just on this idea of driving change and on this idea of having a really dangerous court right now, we can't stop being there. We can't stop being there. If you want the court to change, you have to be there when the court is bad. Because the reason that we are where we are in the court, the Supreme Court is in the position to push out these decisions and these philosophies and these ideas that are incorporating these far-right extremist views, is because for the last 30 years, the conservative bar was there again and again and again, losing often, right, but building in the dissents and in the concurrences a framework for what they wanted to see when they were able to push, when they were able to have power on the court. And you can't, when the court turns bad, turn your back on it and say, well, just ignore it and hopefully someday it'll get better again, right? You have to be helping the court build the blueprint for what better looks like by participating in and being there in those cases. And the court can again be useful, and it can again ultimately be force that pushes and generates progress, even if it's not going to be that right now. And so it's really important to recognize what the court is and isn't, what's available and what isn't available now, but not to abandon the courts, both for the future ability to drive progress in ways that are meaningful and durable and operable, and to make sure that you're continuing the fight against tyranny, because some of that's going to have to happen in the courts, and we'll see how that unfolds. All right, I'm going to hand it off.
That was good, Patrice. Yeah. Okay, so I want to respond. Let me ask this question first. Are there any reporters here? No. Okay. So if there are, I'm just going to state this is off the record, right? Okay.
It's not supposed to be on it.
Okay. I just, I'm trying to decide whether to say stuff I say, like when we're on calls, Dana's heard me say, or, I won't normally say in public, but let me leave that aside for a minute. So let me just tell you what I do and what my context for life is. so I really do policy. You know, I'm a lawyer, but I don't practice anymore. I used to practice. And so I really do policy. And I work from within the EJ, the National Grassroots EJ movement, right? I work at a college. And actually, one thing I don't do well is respond to emails. So I'm sure, Patrice knows. I'm sure there was an email from the organizer of the conference that asked me for my bio, and I didn't send it. So they pulled it off of the internet. So I'm no longer a Thomas Edison sticker. Yeah, that's all right. So the institute I work for is now at a different college, but the important part is that through the institute, through the college, I'm at King University. I work with EJ organizations and the EJ grassroots movement. My home EJ organization is the New Jersey EJ Alliance, and I do a lot of policy for the New Jersey EJ Alliance. I'm one of the co-founders and chair of the board. So I work from within, just for full transparency. And so really with a focus on policy, let me tell you what the challenges are, now. What I really think, and we have a question later about, what do we need? I think we need new, innovative EJ policy. Right? I don't think the policy and the laws now are enough to get us where we want to go. I think for years our communities have been legally polluted to death or to illness. It should be both, right? Legally polluted to illness and to death. So I think we really need to be proactively developing EJ policy. And one of the policies we've been pushing as the EJ community, and particularly in New Jersey, says that we're taking climate change mitigation policy and we say, well, all power plants located in EJ communities, they have to be forced to reduce their emissions. We're trying to reduce coal pollutant emissions. Another thing we worked on in New Jersey, and we got a groundbreaking cumulative impacts bill passed in New Jersey. Again, it's about cumulative impacts, and we want to reduce cumulative impacts in EJ communities. And so we started to say that whenever you have an environmental policy that is supposed to deliver benefits, you have to call out the EJ part in it. Because a lot of times what happens is we have these laws that say, well, they'll benefit everybody, and since the EJ communities are worse off, they probably benefit the EJ communities more. But racism and classism in our country is so insidious that a lot of times that just doesn't happen. So, we're saying you have to have, when I see something now, I say, okay, oh, that's going to help EJ communities? Where's the EJ language? Show me, right? Show me the EJ language in the law or the policy or the regulation. It needs to be in there. But do you see the problem with this, though? Now the Supreme Court, so we're struggling with this every day because our EJ law in New Jersey does call out EJ communities. I'm on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and on the work group that talks about I don't know if you've heard about the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool that's supposed to identify disadvantaged communities. And as a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, we recommend that they use race, right? But I'm saying, oh, we need to call out EJ communities, but how do we do that when the Supreme Court says you can't use race, right? So that's our dilemma now. And in fact, we were working on the policy, and we were scared to death that we were going to put something in there that was going to lead to a bad affirmative action decision. As EJ folks, we didn't want to make that, we didn't want to make the precedent, right? We didn't want other people to come and say, man, you guys really messed up because you're doing this stuff and now you mess it up for everybody. Well, of course, we shouldn't have worried because the Supreme Court was going to wipe out affirmative action anyway. But to me, that's the context. That's our challenge now. How do we define an EJ community if we can't use race explicitly? Well, can we use race-conscious variables? Or can we use variables now that measure racism, kind of like redlining? Is that still open? Or if we can't do that, can we use say variables? Can we use indicators that track with race? Right? Like I work on pollution, like air pollution, right? Particulate matter, concentration of particulate matter track with race. Which of those can we use? Which of those can't we use? So right now, for me, I think for the EJ community in a policy way, the Supreme Court is a hindrance, basically, right? It's like, okay, how do we get around it now? What can we do when we're trying to have these EJ-specific policies that call out communities of color? So how can we get around the Supreme Court? Can we get around the Supreme Court? Now, okay, so let me say this. So that's the challenge. So let me say this. Here's the part. I didn't know if I should say this, but I'll go ahead and say it. I'm old now. What the hell? Don't know how long I have on the earth. Say what you want to say, right? Part of my reaction, though, the race stuff is really problematic with the Supreme Court because it's constitutional, so you can't even pass laws to get around it now. So that's really problematic. But part of what I think is going on is that the Supreme Court, what you were talking about, what is it, the major doctrines? To me, they're just calling people out. They're saying, I think to some degree the progressive community has gotten lazy. We want the courts to do what we should be doing politically, right? And that's the fundamental question is political. And so the court's saying, that's what the court's saying. He's saying, hey, I don't want to be sexist. The court's saying, look, do you have people behind you doing this? And I'm, you can see I'm obviously an African-American male. I'm going to challenge the white community on this. I'm going to challenge the progressive white community on this. You need to get those conservative white folks in order. Right now, the progressive white community has been trying to go around them. You got a fundamental problem that, a third of the country or half the country is conservative and wants Trump. And we're not necessarily going to get around that by going to the courts. I don't know how we're going to get around it, but we got to face it head on. Sometimes I think we're asking the court to do the work that we need to be doing. And I understand why, because the court did some great stuff, like you said, Patrice. But, now it's time to dig in and say, all right, is the court the problem? Or is the problem that we have these folks over here that don't want to do anything? And I'm part of the reason I'm upset now is because, and this I don't want to go too much into the policy, but I see progressive community, and white folks have the power in the country. I see the progressive white community now doing stuff to EJ communities, and I'm like, wait a minute, you all supposed to be on our side. And I see why they're doing it. It's like, well, we can't go to the courts because the courts are conservative. So now we're going to put some policies in place. Now I'm talking about the power plant rule now. We're going to put some policies in place because we can't go to the court. Now we're going to put some policies in place that may sacrifice black communities and brown communities because we can't figure out how else to do it since we can't go to the courts now. Right? And I'm like, wait a minute. Don't sacrifice us to solve your problem with conservative white folks. You all need to get that stuff in order. I'll help you. But fundamentally, it's a question, of political power. And I think we need to focus on that. And if we had political power, the courts wouldn't be what they are, right? So, all right. You hear my frustration with all of this, right? Okay. Who's next?
Can I talk for a quick thought?
Yeah. Okay. I was going to toss it to you, but okay.
There's something really important. I mean, this goes part of what Nikki was saying goes back to some stuff that Professor Shaw was saying earlier today that was really important, right? I mean, there's this idea that movements can't be movements of lawyers. Movements cannot be movements of law. Movements are movements of people and movements of citizen action. And that has to be the case. That's the only thing that drives change. Law is a tool. Lawyering is a skill that you bring in service of movements that are owned by people and driven by citizen action.
I have 1,000 questions. I feel like we could go in 1,000 directions, but I think, like Nikki, you opened up something like really, really powerful, because we have been sitting, in our closed spaces or in our private conversations. I've been sitting in my homes, as some of you may have as well. Like, why won't the administration, and name one that was supposed to be on our side, why aren't they getting in the game? Like, we want you to fight for us. Even if you lose, at least I feel like you got in the battle. I'm going to put my Vaseline on and put my hair in a ponytail and get in there with you. But we want to see you fight. And so I think, like, this is a segue into our next question. And Nikki kind of opened it up. Like, we are asking the courts to do something legally that we should be, or judicially that we should be pursuing politically. And so, Patrice, I'm going to pose the question to you. Like, we are operating in a space where it feels like our governments are afraid, and some of it's been in the context, like, Title VI conversations, for example, like, you don't want to do anything that might weaken it, so let's be quiet. But how do we navigate that kind of space, especially for people who are on the front lines and counting on administrations and or courts to stand in the gap for them? Oh, sorry.
Well, I mean, in part, this is the moment of real frustration, right? Because we clearly have a court that is in the Supreme Court that is salivating to take down some of these principles that are central to the advancement of civil rights, right? They've got an agenda. They've got a playbook. And like I said before, it's a playbook that they're not coming up with on the fly. It has been drafted. It has been written, and the foundation has been laid for it over the past 30 or 40 years. The observation that Nikki was making a minute ago about grappling with these questions of, how do we approach the work that we're doing as a movement? How do we approach both what we're seeking as we're doing advocacy around existing law, and how do we approach new law and new approaches, particularly when it comes to race-conscious policy, right? Because we know that there is machinery in place that is waiting to pounce on that and take it to the Supreme Court and get a bad decision and send things backwards. I think about this as a lawyer who's in this space well, let's recognize that's where we are. And what it means is we're going to have to make decisions as a movement about how do we approach that, right? And you're alluding to this in the conversations that you were having and that NEJEC was having with EPA, saying let's go ahead and use race, even though we know what's going to happen, because that's a strategy, right? That's a strategy. I think we're going to have to struggle with what's the strategy to get through this moment, right? And there's an approach that is we back up, we back off, we soft pedal, we take it easy, hope the landscape changes based on political power building and all of the things that Nikki was just describing. And then when the landscape changes, we move things forward again. And there's another approach that's, no, we keep charging forward and we lose loudly. And we make a ruckus. And we let them know it's not okay, right? And then we're ready to pounce when the time is right and bring it back. I'm a lawyer. I'm a tool. I'm an agent for the movement. It is not my job to decide what the answer to that question is. That is not my job, right? That's the movement's job, and I try to hold in my space what my role is and what my role isn't. I can provide advice. I can talk about these kind of things with audiences like this to think about, hey, what is it we should be doing? But ultimately, we're collectively going to have to be in a position to decide what's the right strategy, and how do we proceed. I wish I had a better answer than that, but.
Since you brought up strategy and landscape, I want to toss it to you, Nikki. Just talk to us about, like, how do we change the game? How do we assess the landscape and then think about the long game?
Okay, let's do it. I'm not going to make y'all get up, but I did make some little papilógrafos, what are these called? Chart papers? Because I'm old school. I'm not old, but I'm old school. Oh, no. Will you sort of help me with these as I go along? Okay, great. Okay, so I wanted to talk about 2 questions. There's a lot keeping me up at night these days, but these are a few of them. One is, what is the connection between the global climate crisis and the global threat of authoritarianism? Is that keeping anybody else up at night? Okay. And secondly, I work for a project called Movement Law Lab. I get to work with movements all over the world, not just climate folks, but people all over the world engaging in very similar set of questions. And organizers have plans, y'all, and they're asking me this question. They're asking us this question in the legal sector of what, how are the lawyers getting into formation to meet the needs ahead, okay? We have got to build a multiracial pro-democracy front in the United States. And listen, organizers have plans in every sector right now. Organizers are moving really good plans. And about a year ago, my team started talking to lawyers, like the lawyers you would think have a plan. And I'm sorry to say, there is no plan, y'all. We do not have a plan. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. Okay. The North American mallard is the highest flying bird in the United States, 21,000 feet. That is where we're up high in the clouds right now, at kind of this mallard level. I'm going to go up even higher. The Rappel griffon vulture. It is the world's highest flying bird, almost 37,000 feet up in the air. Incredible, right? So I want to kind of be way up there just to locate this conversation. At the global level, national stuff, that's the level I'm going to be talking about. And I want to talk about how we understand this moment historically. Next slide, please. We are in, or we are entering a period of backlash, right? That probably, we feel that. It doesn't feel good. A backlash against a lot of the gains that we made during the Black freedom struggles of the 1960s, all of our voting rights laws, lots of our environmental laws, as came out in our discussion, right? A lot of the work that most of us are doing is work to defend the wins of the past, right? Super important work. You also probably have noticed that we haven't been winning a lot of new things lately. Have folks been realizing that? Yeah, that doesn't feel so good, right? Who likes to win here? Anybody like to win? I love to win. Okay, so I want to talk about what we need to do so we get back to a place where we can be moving an offensive agenda. Some of you might know Amanda Alexander in Detroit. She taught me this phrase that we have to be moving offense, defense, and dreaming all at the same time, right? So we're running a lot of defense. We're starting to run some offense, but that integration of the dreaming and offensive realms is where I want to focus a little bit. I think we did this space has been amazing, not just here, but this morning's sessions also on, interrupting what I think is perhaps the most dangerous myth that we have to debunk as lawyers leveling up, lawyers who want to build power, which is that this false theory of change that legal victories alone or policy victories alone are the drivers of social change, right? It's like we all know that theoretically, but let me tell you, I work with lawyers all over the United States and all over the world, and even those of us who nod our heads in rooms like this go back to institutions, and our institutions do not move with the wisdom of these like heads that are nodding in here. We continue to move legal strategy that is still very narrowly in these like transactional boxes of thinking about legal strategies and really legal victories, right, as the way that social change occurs. Some of you, does anybody work in a job? You don't have to, okay, I'm not gonna ask you this, but just nod silently to yourself if you've ever had a job or worked in, your current job is like that, right? It's like there is something about the momentum of our institutions that sort of keeps us stuck in this sort of mindset. So, obviously, much more than isolated legal victories, much more than charismatic individuals, right? We know that organized communities have always been the driver of change. So I was training ACLU's national team when the Dobbs decision dropped. And, I will say that the reaction of their team was very similar to the reaction of the general public and lots of lawyers. It was like total shock, right? Which on the one hand is totally understandable. It was a shocking moment. But we have to move from this state of constant surprise. I mean, this decision was leaked ahead of time, right? There was not, I mean, it was shocked. I don't mean to put shade on those of us that were shocked. That's a totally fine emotion to feel, but we have to get out of this mindset of wishful thinking into one of sober assessments, into one of coherent and careful long-term strategy. So, there are way more elites, and I'm gonna put progressive lawyers in that camp of elites who are learning what BIPOC folks have known forever, right? That Americans' origin story is one that is based on genocide and racial terror, that led us to a set of systems and institutions that are messed up. They're flawed, they're corrupt, they're racist, they're classist, they are not working. Or maybe better to say, they are working exactly as they were designed to work under our system of racial monopoly capitalism. And that is a very different way to describe our history than this liberal view that like things are getting better every time and we're sort of making progress along the way, right? So, this is whether you're looking at healthcare or police stuff or the COVID response or democracy work, climate stuff, housing rights, it's like at this rappel, griffin, vulture flying level that I'm trying to keep us on, it is safe to say that the Supreme Court is behaving consistently with the way that the Supreme Court has always behaved, okay? We can and should have the intellectual conversation about, is this the worst court ever in the course of history? I love those conversations, let's have them. And also at this rappel, griffin, vulture level, like we know that that is not the place that we're gonna get free, okay? And a lot of us are still acting like it, including people, in rooms like this all over the country. So I want to talk about, I think what has changed is that the dominant bloc has shifted. The dominant bloc has shifted. And we are getting out-organized by the right, and we are getting out-organized by the right on the terrain of law. It's obvious, right? I want to talk about thank you, next slide. Do you guys like that I tried to draw you vultures last night in my hotel room? Okay, I started getting tired, so there's less vultures as this goes on. I want to talk about the character of the MAGA bloc, okay? Make America Great, the character of the MAGA bloc. First, the MAGA bloc has to be understood in a global context. It is the US manifestation of a global rise in right-wing authoritarian movements that is increasingly well-coordinated. My organization houses a global network of movement lawyers in 26 countries. We've been studying the authoritarian playbook and mapping how the authoritarians, how sort of like trends towards authoritarianism show up in our different contexts. And I can tell you, it's very similar. And the good news is also the interventions that we can make on the social movement side are also very similar. Like we have lots of examples from all over the world. We know what we need to do. We just need to do it. Secondly, the MAGA block. Who is in the MAGA block? Do people feel like they already know this? I mean, it's super complex. There's a bunch of stuff out there. Go read up on this. It's really important that we understand the nature of our opposition. So the MAGA block is anchored in two of the most deeply rooted sectors of the U.S. society. So we've got, on the one hand, we've got a wing of the capitalist class that is centered in the fossil fuel industry, lots of folks that you all are going up against, and a set of reactionary billionaires led by libertarians, like the role of the libertarians, y'all. If you're not tracking this, Nancy McLean's book, Democracy in Chains, is a beautiful history of the role of James Buchanan. Obviously, Koch brothers, names that are a bit more familiar. So we've got these like the super nutty billionaires. And then we have a large layer of people of many, many classes, okay, a cross-class alliance who, we can dissect them, that's another lecture, but these are folks who are, the one thing they have in common is that they believe in a world that is ordered along racial and gender hierarchies, okay? So that is like the quickest way that I can describe this MAGA block for you. Obviously, there's a newer part of the block that is armed. These are the January 6th sort of folks. And, people who, this tenet of people who want to use extrajudicial violence is a trend that likewise dates back to the origins of our country. Okay, so these, again, are not new tactics. So the MAGA block, it has now captured the Supreme Court. It has captured many parts of the federal judiciary. It has captured the Republican Party, and it now has a trifecta. That means, legislative majorities and the governorship in 22 states, okay? This is not good news. This is not good news. And there's a lot of apathy amongst organizers and lawyers. This kind of like, fuck the law approach, right? The law alone won't save us. I have lots of days where I feel like that too. But I concur with the rest of the panelists here that the law absolutely is a terrain of struggle. We have got to contend on the terrain of law. We cannot cede this terrain to the right. What do they want? They want to impose authoritarian rule. They want to block the gains of the past. And y'all, they have plans. If you're not up late at night, start reading their plans. They have, there is a 2025 plan that the Heritage Foundation funded and put out. It is a terrifying document. It is well resourced. They lay it all out there. It's basically get Trump elected in 2024 and begin immediately a shift to authoritarian rule in the United States. I absolutely think we have to take these sort of threats credibly. They are telling us what they're going to do. They have been telling us what they're going to do for 50 years now, and it's time that we start really paying attention. Like, it's not hyperbole. It's not a bunch of kind of wackos there are wackos in the corner, but they are powerful, okay? Let's go to the next slide. Thank you for helping me, by the way. Okay, so I want to talk for a second about something I've been learning from political scientists who are studying this moment, who are using this term that I hadn't heard of, electoral autocracy, which is the most common form of authoritarian governance today. All over the world. And MAGA operatives have also been studying the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, and they know that the fascists then first came to power legally. Fascists first came to power legally, okay? So in an electoral autocracy, we see semi-competitive elections. Does that seem familiar? Louisiana, we just had 23% voter turnout in our last election, okay? So semi-competitive elections that kind of look like normal, look like everything's good, but other really important features of democracy, such as the rule of law, separation of powers, civil rights, free press, are weak, start to erode, disintegrate altogether. I'm in spaces right now, I was in a meeting 2 days ago with a comrade in India who told me more like an assessment of Florida than anyone in the United States who I've ever spoken to. And he's like, you know, in 5 years, it's gonna look like Modi in Florida if you don't do something now. So I think that there are, you know, we have to be tracking how these trends sort of aggregate, and the courts are important terrain, and it's much beyond the courts as well. So this is everything from like, you know, short-term stuff, the disinformation, voter suppression, gerrymandering, the medium-term stuff like banning forms of speech, emergency decrees, security for domestic policing, consolidation of executive power, loss of court and independence. Does that sound familiar? I mean, we're already at like a medium level on a bunch of this stuff. And then longer term stuff, they're also already planning. They're having meetings about stuff like amending and rewriting our Constitution, extending term limits, things like that. So it's like, even our idea of like what the court is like the court itself as an entity is going to shift. Like the structure of the court is likely to shift as if the right succeeds in gaining more power. Next one. Okay. The last thing I wanted to talk about is what I see as the primary contradiction, or like the main dynamic that's shaping this moment, which is a drive by this MAGA bloc, right? We already talked about who those people are. They want to impose authoritarian rule. It's a white nationalist, Christian agenda on the country versus, and this is like a multiracial pro-democracy front. This is what I'm working on all the time, and I get the question, well, what is that front? Who is in that front? It's like, well, it's like everywhere and nowhere. Like all of us are probably in that front, but we're not exactly articulated with each other, right? And organizers want to know, who are the lawyers that are gonna back up, bolster, and defend this multiracial pro-democracy movement? And part of it is starting to see democracy as something, there's like, I'm sometimes embarrassed to tell folks that I'm working more and more on democracy stuff because people are like, democracy? This is like a bourgeois concern, and it's like, oh no, this is a sexy issue, everybody. Let me tell you, this is something like, and it's like we have to put adjectives in front of it, like multiracial, cross class, so everyone gets excited about it again. But like, just like we can't see the terrain of law, we cannot see the terrain of democracy to the right either. So the drama today really centers on whether this MAGA bloc is going to be successful in gaining full federal power in 2024 or soon after, and if they are beaten back, it's like, well, what is the character of the anti-MAGA governing coalition? So for us, the central objective really is to defeat Trump electorally in 2024. It's like, that's sort of the place where if we don't do that, none of the stuff that all of us want to do is going to be possible. And that means that we may, in fact, we will probably need to support a really lackluster neoliberal, centrist Democrat that makes us all totally want to puke. And, that's going to be even more unappetizing as Biden and the Democrats, in the face of their cowardice, in the face of the unfolding genocide in Palestine. Like, it's going to be really hard to turn folks out. But it's like that really is a foundational building block and something that we're trying to do a lot of agitations cross-sectorally to get, nobody's going to be like, oh, this is so fun and I love turning out for this mainstream Dem. But like, if we don't do that, we got a taste of that under the last Trump years. Okay. Should I stop there and we can talk about where we go from here next, or should I just keep talking about all these things?
We're running out of time.
Okay, great. Well, I have thoughts on where we should go from here, but I'll let you guide us there. Does that sound good?
Well, we dropped
No.
a lot of information, and I was going to ask people, like, just open it up for 1 or 2 questions.
Oh, great.
I'm afraid to do that now.
Awesome.
Because we have 9 minutes, and if I let one,
Oh yeah, let's take some questions.
okay.
Or maybe we could take them in like a clump, like 3 questions at a time or something, so we can see what's out there.
Okay, if you all promise not to editorialize, but ask a question. So,
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead?
Patrice, I was hoping that you would elaborate a little bit on how we might mimic the rights plan for planning way ahead with the courts and laying the groundwork for our future victory.
I guess my question, just sort of trying to process everything that we've heard, and one question that I have is how we have the conversation about, or like, do you have thoughts about how to have the conversation about whose lead we are following in terms of the strategy on how bold we are, and like whether it is we go to the mat and we lose, or we do what happened with the abortion cases and we hedge and hope and lose. And then the other question that I have is, given the reality that we are in and that, you know, the choice is Biden or Trump at this point, and given that even under the Biden administration, where now they have had this alleged mandate, and the need for accountability is very, like, in some ways higher than it was before, right? Because now we have all of these federal funds that they say are going to be going to EJ and doing all of these things, and how we hold folks accountable even as the courts, yeah, I guess how we hold people accountable in the policy and administrative space as the courts are hostile.
How do we create a social justice mafia to combat the mafia of mediocre minds that is the Federal Society?
I don't know who got that one.
I'll do really quick because I really want to hear the answers to the other questions. Carrie, to your question, I don't know that I know the blueprint. I think there's a couple of things that are obvious. One, as a part of this conversation about democracy and otherwise, we have to repeatedly be emphasizing the importance of the courts. I think people do not understand generally the value of the courts, and we're only starting to appreciate that when the courts suddenly are so dramatically out of control. So really amping up that conversation around why the courts matter so much. And then I think doing a really good job providing the legal blueprints to the folks who are our allies, to you know, including our allies on the Supreme Court, to Justice Jackson and Sotomayor and Kagan. Like, what does it look like to lay the foundation for what a real progressive legal vision looks like that we can jump on with this movement when the time comes. Those are a couple of things, but I think there's a lot more to answer that I don't know that I have the answer for.
So even though I vented my frustrations earlier, I definitely agree we need the strategy, and I think the broad questions on that, and then once you come up with the answer, what's the legal strategy that fits that then, right? The more specific, what case do you bring? But your question is we were struggling with that already, you know, before the affirmative action case. And I'll just say there are some, Dana leads one, but there are some EJ coalitions, you know, amongst 3 or 4 of the coalitions where you have a whole lot of EJ groups. And for me, I would probably start there, and then, you know, across the aisle to our environmental cousins, and then to the civil rights movement, and, you know, and try to, I'm not saying it's easy, you know, that's an organizing question, basically. But I think we do have to do it. And I was really in that conundrum because I'm in kind of an awkward space where I provide kind of technical assistance to the EJ movement, but also do some leading at the same time, which is awkward. And, you know, I just listened to people until I got a feel for where I thought the EJ movement was. You know, different meetings, different coalitions at WEJAC, and just really listen to what folks were saying. And after a while, I got a pretty clear picture, and people were kind of in the space of, we're going to go for it at that point, I don't know where people are now, though. Now the Supreme Court decision came out. But yeah, I think to me that's the $50 million question. How do we actually do this organizing now?
Testing. Listen, y'all, there are 1.3 million lawyers in the United States. Guess how many of them work on issues of justice and poverty? Just throw out a number. 50? 2? Huh? 100,000? About 3%, according to some stats. I don't even know how they make up these things. But listen, that's all the legal aid folk. I mean, it's like any issues of justice and poverty. So those of us who are actually trying to build power, who are moving with a movement lawyer orientation to the work, it's like we're a sliver of a sliver of a sliver. So I think that we need to, the stance that we need to have inside this question is very much one of an organizer, right? It's like, how do we organize the legal sector? How do we look at turf, just like you would cut turf in any campaign, and think about the 1.3 million lawyers in the country and think about what we need to do to get that sector queued up for the fights ahead. And there are people, I'm in spaces right now with folks trying to build a left response to ALEC. There are small spaces that are kind of the zygotes of what we hope will become a left response to the Federalist Society. It's not like it's not like we just get in rooms like this and we're like, shit, somebody should do that. Folks are trying. A lot of how the MAGA block was built was with private billionaire money. They just had a lot more space to dream and play than, it's like, where is the pots of money to do those sorts of convenings and to, so anyway, there are resource challenges, there are ideological challenges, I think there are challenges in just how our orientation to the work, and all of us are making baby steps all the time in a very intersectional way to move bits and pieces of that forward. But particularly on the stuff around building this multiracial pro-democracy front, if that's something that you're juiced up about, please holler at me. We're moving a bunch of work in that frame. And also, since I have the mic, if anybody knows any famous people who want to go to the Rafah border crossing on a delegation outside of Palestine that we're putting together for next week, we need more famous people. And you guys probably know some. So holler at me afterwards if you know of anybody.
All right, y'all. So we got 2 minutes, and we still had a piece about states that I just have to ensure that Nikki gets to share. And so I think when you brought up ALEC, that was good, because if everybody is familiar with ALEC, let me just make sure you know the American Legislative Exchange Council, which put together model bills and policies that got implemented at the state level. And so that is a nice way for us to transition into how some folks are working to address issues at the state level that aren't getting addressed federally.
So let me give you a ray of hope. I mentioned that in New Jersey we passed an EJ and cumulative impacts law, and whole other talk. But cumulative impacts, multiple sources of pollution, how you deal with them. That's arguably the premier issue, EJ issue in the country, right? Where communities say, hey, we have too many polluting facilities. Why are you going to put one more in? This is killing us. So the law directly addresses that. For the first time, we have a law that says you must turn down applications for pollution permits based on EJ and cumulative impacts. And New York passed an even stronger version of it, although I understand it could still be some negotiating there. Washington is also, and I don't know the details of that, looking at such a law. Albuquerque, and the county in which Albuquerque sits, is going to have hearings on a similar rule. So it's a breakthrough, right? Because the EJ communities, I used to say it's like the holy grail of the EJ movement, EJ in permitting and stopping the pollution permits based on EJ. So it's catching fire, One of the problems is we hope that the federal courts don't stop it, basically. And that's the danger. That's one of the dangers, you know, that the federal courts could stop it. Now, there's other stuff going on, like, you know, again, out of the court system in Albuquerque, the county Albuquerque sits in, what businesses have done, that they are trying to actually abolish the council that would approve of this law. Imagine that. Their response is just abolish the council. That'll take care of it. You know, I don't know if they're afraid they're going to lose. But anyway, this is happening. I just want you to know this is happening on the state level. And that's just what we wanted. We're hoping it would be replicated and even going beyond like New York has around the country, since we can't gain traction on this issue, you know, policy-wise or legally-wise, on the federal level.
Last note on lawyers. Every one of these things will be challenged in court. Every one of these things needs to be defended. There's going to be fights happening at every stage.
It's already been challenged.
That is right.
They've already filed suits.
And then I'll just end by saying, folks in the EJ forum that we convened were really excited about, like, the work that Nikki and others in New Jersey did and what happened in New York. We put together a 5-model legislation bill package. It's called Dismantling Injustice. What is it called? As much as I did with this thing. I don't know, y'all. Dismantling Injustice. I'll look for it. But it's 5 bills that speak to cumulative impact, setting up EJ advisory boards. It's our own version of the Good Neighbor Rule, so cross-state air pollution, or cross-community or cross-county air pollution, heavy, medium, heavy-duty truck rules. So we are trying to do some work. This was such a powerful conversation. I felt like we could probably talk for another hour. I'm fired up. I hope you will get with all the people who are on the panel and whoever wants to work on the strategy. Let's get together on the strategy, and we'll all pick our pieces based off of our area expertise and make America great again.